Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac. I'm in here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. Our program looks at articles and book reviews that are published by Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, which is the journal of the American Scientific Affiliation. And today we are focused on a featured book review in the June 2022 issue of the journal. And the book that is reviewed was titled Thinking About Evolution, 25 Questions Christians Want Answered. And the authors were A.J. Roberts, Fazale Rana, Sue Dykes, and Mark Perez. Unfortunately, at the last minute, or fairly late, none of the authors was able to attend. It's unfortunate, but we have a number of capable people to represent their view as well. But as is our practice, we then go to the book review author, and we are happy to have the author of the review, Alex Werth, with us today. And so, Alex, say hello to the group.
Thank you so much, Randy. I'm really happy to be here. It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. So I'll try to keep my questions brief so we can have as many questions as possible.
Okay, that's great. So let's start out by having a little bit of a conversation about you, because I really didn't know about you before I read your book review. And I suspect a number of people in the audience may not know you either. So I see you were at Hampton Sydney College. I wasn't aware of the college. What's the college all about?
So it's a very small liberal arts college. I'm an evolutionary biologist who teaches there. I've been here. I just finished 30 years, so I'm just starting my 31st year. I'm originally from New England, but I really like being here in the green rolling hills of Virginia. So Hampton Sydney is a very old college. Depending on how you count it, it's the 10th oldest college in the country. It was founded back when Virginia was still a British colony. And James Madison and Patrick Henry were amongst its founders. And William Henry Harrison, the U.S. president, went here. Class of 1791. That's
a lot of history. Is that its key claim to fame, or what is its focal point, or its raison d'etre?
Well, it's claim to fame or infamy. So this is not the Deep South, but it's the Old South. Cultures and traditions die hard here. We are one of really two schools in the U.S. that is still all male, along with Wabash College in Indiana. So it's not
still
that
all male.
Absolutely, yeah. We're very traditional, conservative in that regard. So.
Wow, and the males tolerate that. That's interesting.
We're surrounded by women's colleges. Let me put it that way.
Okay, all right. There's flip side.
Not a cloistered monastery. I'll put it that way.
Well, let's just briefly look at your background a little bit. Are you from Virginia, or is that where you started, or where are you from?
I grew up in far western Massachusetts in the Berkshire Hills.
Very good. Oh, that's beautiful country. What part? We're there quite a bit.
Pittsfield.
Pittsfield, yes. Okay, good, great. So how did you, where did you get your education? How did you proceed from there?
Got a little bit tired of the cold and snow and wanted to experience a little bit of the rest of the country, and especially go to a place with a marine lab. As I'll explain, I do a lot of work on sea creatures. So I went and got my bachelor's degree in zoology at Duke University and studied at the Marine Lab and what was then called the Primate Center, now the Lemur Center. Then returned back to New England and got my master's and PhD in evolutionary biology from Harvard. Did a brief postdoc working on whales in the northernmost point in the U.S., at the northernmost point in Alaska, and then back in the mid-Atlantic ever since.
Yeah. So being in Pittsfield, that's a ways off from the coast. How'd you get into marine life? What got you interested in it?
Well, so I'll tell you this story, and I'll try to keep it brief, but it explains why I'm both an evolutionary biologist and a marine biologist. And it involves the only real trophy I've ever won in my life. I was in third grade, and it was for an elementary school science fair project. I read a book, which I still have with me. It was written by Roy Chapman Andrews, who was a famous fossil hunter, and according to some accounts, at least in part, the inspiration for Indiana Jones, because he was famous for raiding countries of fossils. And there are all these accounts that he was spiriting dinosaur fossils out of Mongolia, staying one step ahead of people who were firing rifles at him. Anyway, he wrote this book called All About Whales. I loved nature. And as a kid, I was reading this book. It had the obligatory figure of how many buses long a whale is and how many elephants it weighs. He had this figure showing the skeleton of a whale, and he explains all the parts of a whale. And then he dropped this bombshell that there's two little bones hanging under the spine. There's no bones in the flukes of the tail, but there are these two little bones, which are vestigial pelvic and leg bones. And when I read that, I was amazed. I was flabbergasted. I was blown away, and most of all, I was hooked. I was hooked first of all on sea creatures, and especially cetaceans, whales and dolphins. Second, I thought, how cool is this idea of evolution? And really, third, this is why the special field within evolution that I'm in is studying morphology, anatomy. I realized that cutting open creatures is like opening up a treasure chest. You never know what you're going to find, but there's a good chance it'll be something. So I've actually cut a pelvic bone from a bowhead whale in Alaska.
Wow.
I bring this to class and I ask students what kind of bone they think it is. And then once they learn what kind of bone it is, how can they explain why a whale has a leg bone? So
that's great tool. So let's before we get into the content, can you share a little bit about your faith history? Did you grow up as a Christian? Did you come to faith later, or what's your background?
So yeah, and I'm don't mean to be mysterious, but I purposefully tell my students that I'm not trying to conceal anything, but I don't feel it's my place to really question other people's faith, and so I tend not to say much about mine. But yeah, I grew up in a mainline Protestant background. And I was raised Episcopal, but I've been affiliated with places Methodist to now I'm at a Presbyterian school, part of PCUSA. But really, my background is far more ecumenical than evangelical. I'll put it that way.
Okay, fair enough.
And just by way of introducing the discussion, I am a scientist, and I make no bones about that. But I think it's very important to make clear that there's a lot of really important questions that science cannot answer. So there's room for other things, as we'll get into, I'm sure.
All right. So to lead into that, how in the world did you come about to choose this book and to write this review?
Good question. So I was asked to write this review for this book by Sarah Tolsma, who is a biology professor at Northwestern College in Iowa. I've been involved for a number of years, both on my campus and elsewhere, in really trying to improve reconciliation between not only evolution and faith, but more broadly science and religion. And I make clear to people that I don't like when people describe science versus religion or evolution versus faith. Rather, I see them as different approaches to knowledge. So I spent some time at a National Science Foundation sponsored program out in Utah at BYU. It was run by a biology professor there, Jamie Jensen. And so I organized a team from my school, bringing our pastor, someone who teaches religion, and me as a biologist. That's where I first met Sarah. This was a number of years ago, pre-pandemic. And then I went back again last fall, I guess, for the first post-pandemic conference. And I had written an earlier book review, and Sarah gave me this one and said, "I know you're an evolutionary biologist, so could you do this one?" And I said, "Okay,
cool. Okay, that's great. All right, so let's move into an actual discussion of the review. I'm expecting that most of you that joined here have read the review, since it's only 2 pages long. And I hope many of you have also read the book itself. And so, as is our custom on these programs, we will start with a conversation with those who've submitted questions and comments in advance, and then we'll move on to open questions. And I would encourage you to submit your questions not on the chat, which you can do if you want them on the record, but I'm not going to read those chats. I can't do 2 things at once. And so please click on reactions at the bottom and raise your hand, and I will call on you because raising hand will let me know you want to say something, and I will give you permission to talk. So that's going to be our role. And we're going to start with the 4 or 5 people who submitted some questions in advance. So the first one out of the chute was Josh Swamidas. Josh, it's good to see you on the program again. And Dana, you can enable everyone to unmute if they so wish. And Josh, if you could unmute and start the discussion here with Alex.
Yeah, I forgot exactly what I submitted, but thanks a lot. First of all, it's great to meet you, Alex, and thank you for reviewing the book too. So I affirm evolution too. I'm actually one of the people who endorsed the book. And one thing that I think maybe might have been missed in your review, and I wonder if you could comment on it, was two things that I thought are notable. One is that they really pose everything as questions. My experience in talking with them was that they really are wanting a good faith dialogue and engagement. And they also have a track record of changing their view based on evidence. I can give you examples if you want. So yes, there's much to disagree with in the book, but I think that there's an opportunity for a sort of response that engages them more in dialogue about it and engages with them. That's the first thing. And along those lines, one of the things I thought was very notable about the book was that that the last chapter of the book asked the question of what if they were wrong? What if actually Big E evolution is true? Which I don't know of any creationist book out there that asks that question, which is incredibly humble, first of all, to even ask that question and take it seriously. And they show how they would make sense of it theologically, which I think shows that while they certainly is theological baggage or points of view that are really driving their position, they're not actually committed to opposing evolution. So once again, I think that really is an opportunity to really, even if we think that they're wrong-headed and wrong on many of the scientific points, which I certainly think so too, I think that there's a real opportunity to engage them and take them, at face value in their questions and try and give some solid responses and dialogue over them, because they could actually even change their mind, right?
Well, so thank you very much, Josh, for that, both for the introductory comments and that question. So let me give a couple of quick prefatory comments, and I hope not to be long here, but in our conversation today, as in the review, it's never my intent to offend anybody. Also, I try not to be condescending. And this afternoon, I don't ever want to come across as pedantic. I don't want to tell people things that they already know, but I apologize. I don't want to risk skipping a couple of steps and then having people say, well, wait a minute, your answer makes no sense. You left out a bunch there. So I apologize if I ever come across as speaking down to anybody. I agree. It's wonderful that they admit that they might be wrong. I think that's and I agree with you that that's very rare from books from the faith community, but my background as a scientist, that's not particularly notable. I see that as a very low bar, the bare minimum. I tell my students all the time that they're going to hear a few things from me when they ask questions. The first is, I don't know. I don't think it's ever a shame to admit when you don't know something. Secondly, I never hesitate to say, I was mistaken. I was wrong. I think there's real shame in doubling down and holding a position when evidence shows otherwise, rather than admitting you were wrong. The third thing that I might say today when asked a question is, what do you think? And my intent is not to deflect or avoid or evade questions, but I think there's a real benefit to having people ponder something and come to a conclusion rather than just me spoon feeding it to them. And I hope we get to talk a lot today about why I think science is difficult for many people, because it's really counterintuitive. I think as young children, we flock to science because we have this sense of wonder and love of the world. But then science starts to get really, really counterintuitive. And I hope we get to talk about one of the main ways in which science is counterintuitive, because it, unlike most of our daily lives, it revolves not at all around proving things, but disproving things. Right. But yeah, I agree that they did pose things as questions. And that was actually one of the biggest problems that I had with the book, is the questions that they, not necessarily the questions that they asked, but I would have asked a series of different questions, and not just as a scientist, but for people of faith. I think they should have asked questions that currently are controversial within the science, like what is the unit of evolution or of selection? What about rates of evolution? Those are some of the very active areas of scientific questioning that I had hoped that they would get into, rather than what I saw as kind of some tired old questions that were really treading a lot of old ground. But to wrap up your question, Josh, I'm pleased that they're willing to change their minds based on new evidence and to admit that they might be wrong. I think that humility is lacking in our world in general. I would hope we would all agree, but even among scientists. And you'll hear me say today that one of the things that bothers me from a lot of my fellow scientists is this sense that theirs is the only path. And so I'm pretty vehemently opposed to scientism, this notion that science is the only path toward answers and that there's, you don't need anything but science. So I was pleased with that aspect of the book, but really I don't want to, you probably not want to hear me say this, but my sense is even if you were a believer, you shouldn't have to compromise your science. You shouldn't have to compromise your acceptance of empirical evidence. So I would recommend that people not just read books about science that just deal with belief, but for the same reason that scientists typically don't rely on divine explanations, just read any good book on evolution. You don't have to agree with what's in there, but I think that's always the best starting point. I'm sure we can elaborate further.
You saying that exactly?
What's that?
You said you'll probably have a hard time with me saying this. Why do you think?
Well, because I think, let me put it this way. I do understand why they wrote the book the way they did, both their approach to writing it, but also the marketing being toward believers, toward Christians. But my sense is, especially for people from a progressive creationist background or people with the ASA background, what's stopping you from reading any book about evolution or any book about science for that matter? Why does it have to be geared toward Christians? Yeah, that's my question. So I would like you all to think about that.
Aren't we already reading books like that? I don't understand what you're asking.
Well, I think, Alex, in this community, it probably isn't too much of a problem. But I think it is for much of the broader Christian community. Yeah. So Josh, if I may, I'd like to comment on your second point because I think it's extremely good and worthwhile. And I think Alex may not be as familiar with the history of the ASA and to understand. So if I may be so bold as the host here, I'd like to interject a little bit with a brief view of that history to show why I think your point is so important, Josh. The fact that the authors here end the book with the perspective that evolutionary creation or theistic evolution is a viable option for Christians. Now, why is that important and how did that come to be? Because the ASA was founded in an environment where that was definitely not the case. And there are quotes from some of the early founders and leaders of the ASA that says no ASA member would be a theistic evolutionist. And it was really not an acceptable position at that time. But if you look at the history of, I should add that there has always been a diversity of views in the ASA, and I hope there always will be, because that's what constitutes dialogue. And in the early days, there was a strong young Earth creationism view, and I think most of you who know the history know that in the 60s, that was a big issue, and Henry Morris and Duane Gish, among several others, then felt there wasn't enough support. They were ASA fellows, and they formed the Creation Research Society, but they stayed ASA fellows. So from that point on, the percentage of ASA members who were young Earth creationists has dwindled, never went to zero, still isn't. But progressive creationism at that point kind of became the dominant view in the ASA, and it was kind of everyone held it. And theistic evolution was not well received, but it gradually gained momentum, kind of a first step with Bernard Ram's books. But as I understand history, and what influenced me as well, were the writings of Richard Bew. And of course, he's published more articles in the journal than any other author. Of course, he was editor for a long time, but he has over 100 articles. But I well recall when he says, I'm not trying to tell you that I am a theistic evolutionist, but I want everyone to understand that theistic evolution is a viable option for Christians. That was 50 years ago. And it took a long time for it to take hold and be recognized, and there is gradually a transition. The survey we did of ASA members in 2008 indicated that about 60% of ASA members at that time had really reflected views of that kind. And I suspect it's about that, maybe a little bit more now. But progressive creation is still a very strong component here, and I think that's a positive one. So we've got this whole spectrum, from a young Earth creation to progressive creation to evolutionary creation, and many variations in the thing. I mean, there's more than 3 over here, although they're typical, but they go through there. So Josh, you're still on the hook. So, but I wanted to kind of give that historical perspective that the importance of theistic evolution as being viable, whether it's correct or not, another issue.
Randy, thank you for that history. As I warned you up front, I'm going to admit there's a lot I don't know.
That's fine.
So, case in point.
Yeah, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying about them not asking. I mean, there's a couple of context things I just want to give that will help make some sense. I understand what you're saying. Like, if this is a book that was really trying to understand the forefront of evolutionary science, it would have different questions. I think they're just bringing their questions, and I think that should be something that we're receptive to.
Yes.
I've spent time talking with them. I think they're very, even if they're wrong-headed, I really think they're really genuine questions, and I think it really, it really behooves us to really receive them with empathy in that regard. That's one thing.
Fair enough, and we'll have a chance to engage them shortly.
And then on the issue of where their last chapter is, it's interesting that they actually don't talk about, and so in terms of Christians being able to affirm evolution, they've always been okay with that. What's different about that last chapter is they talk about what would theologically make sense for them, and they don't actually put themselves. They basically don't actually affirm evolutionary creation. They take a very different theological approach, and I think that's notable. I mean, and that came out of a lot of dialogue through the DeBar conferences, which they discussed there too. So I think that's important, because even let's say they are never convinced about evolution, that particular group of scientists. Sue Dykes is a late Sue Dykes. She passed away shortly after the book was published too. So we're not going to convince her. but even if that's the case, there's a lot of people in their community that I think they're really correctly expressing what the theological concerns of that group are, and it's very distinct from going down like a more progressive path or evolutionary creation, or however you want to call it.
Well, Josh, let me just say, and I tried to note this in the review, I did appreciate their humility, and I find that very refreshing, and that's why I tried to compliment that in my review. So your point is very well taken.
Okay, let's move on and give another. We'll come back to, you'll all have another chance later, I believe. But the second question submitted in advance or comment was Del Kuhn. Del, your turn.
Randy, I hope I'm coming. I hope my audio is coming through okay. And I
can hear you.
It's a new computer. I hope I don't look as bad as I do on my screenshot.
Yeah, you do. You look pretty bad. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna keep to my notes so I don't drift too much, but I appreciated the book. I'm kind of a cold water, hopefully respectful disagreement instead of other ways of disagreement. But my background is chemistry. I found the book interesting, and I'm not going to presume to comment on any of the biology in the book. That's for other people. But I really can't get on board with the book's objective. I think the authors are correct in discussing philosophy in the opening chapters, because I think that's where things like God, purpose, and so forth should be discussed, but not inside one of the sciences like biology, which is only looking at a subset of reality, namely the material world. And especially, I don't think that God should be in biology or any science as a theistic hypothesis, even diluting him down to something like nature plus or more than material, because in essence, that makes God the subject of that science instead of being the Lord over it. And if it doesn't actually come to scientism, it floats with it. And I think it also plays into militant atheist contentions that, quote, faith is contrasted with, quote, knowledge, and that religious beliefs are eventually going to disappear as scientific knowledge replaces, quote, faith. And I know that one author expects that a theistic model is going to slide right into leading to God as revealed in Christ. What I'm wondering is that if more than material or nature plus ever comes in to be a valid scientific explanation, what's the content of that more and plus going to be? And I'm not being frivolous when I'm saying that since 60% of scientists report no religious affiliation, I'd make a side bet that the 2001 monolith was going to be the plus before God of the Bible is going to be the plus. But I think more likely materialistic or naturalistic explanations are going to fill in ever narrowing gaps for God, and God's especially simply going to be squeezed out. So my feeling is let's keep God outside science, above science, as Lord of everything, and leave our discussion about purposes and so forth at a higher level, and emphasize that God doesn't account for that science can't account for everything. So it's more of a comment than a question, and I guess I want to get it out on the table, but I don't think
Thank you.
This should dominate at the afternoon.
It won't.
I'm more or less signing off unless you ask me to come back.
Well,
Thanks.
I really appreciate that extended comment, Del. So thank you for that. And here's how I would approach that. I in many of my different courses that I teach, I ask students early on, why is the sky blue? So I would ask you all to reflect on this now. Why is the sky blue? And I turn students loose. I give them 10, 15 minutes to think about this, work on this in small groups. Invariably, they come back to me with all kinds of physical explanations, different wavelengths of light and Rayleigh scattering and so on and so forth. And I go through and listen to all the students' explanations. And I say, well, here's another one. Suppose the sky is blue because that's God's favorite color. Invariably, students snicker a little bit. And I say, well, hold on. Can't that be true? Can't the sky be blue because that's God's favorite color? And I get them to see that that's an absolutely reasonable explanation. There's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, there's no way that you can disprove that, which is my whole point, that science is about disproving things. And that could be a perfectly reasonable explanation, but you can't do anything with it. You can't test it. You either believe it or you don't. And this is why in any science book, you're never going to see a divine explanation. You won't find it, not just in biology, but in a chemistry or physics book. You won't see, because that's the way God wanted it. But that's not to rule out that possibility. It could, and no matter what your perspective is, whether it's theistic or progressive creationism, there's always that possibility that it's because of God. But I think, your question about theistic versus atheistic, I think science gets a bad rap because it necessarily is atheistic. Science would not be science. We would not get anywhere. We would not be able to do any investigations if we allowed theistic explanations in there. But I think there's a world of difference between methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism. And I think people don't understand that scientists can't rely on divine explanations, but that doesn't mean that they can't accept them when they put their science behind and look at all the rest of the world. So I could go on, but I hope that makes sense.
I think it does, and I think we'll get back into that after we go through these submitted questions, because it's. I'm sure there will be some people here who want to comment on that. The third person to comment here, I have a question, was Ken Turian. Ken, I see you over there. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
My background in physical science is not biological, so I really have no claims on looking at evolutionary creation or the evolutionary processes in a scientific way per se. My portion is I hide behind the statement, God did it, but how? In other words, we will never really know the final answer when it comes to creation, origins, and creation. As a generic background. My point is, if there is a bias, I did not read the book, but I read the comments very carefully. At the end, the comment says, because of the bias, they have taken this approach, the RTB type approach or progressive creationist. Isn't there a bias the other way around? In other words, evolutionary creation. There's always a bias in our understanding of nature, more or less. So to me, it's the reason I say this is because there is acrimony between progressive creationism and evolutionary creationism. There's IDs dislike evolutionary creation. RTB doesn't say much either way or the other, but instead of pulling together and saying, okay, we're brothers in Christ and each of us look at it a different way, we seem to jump at each other more often than we should. That is my point.
Yeah, and so my quick response to that, and I appreciate that. Thank you for those comments and that question. This is why I think there often is friction, because science only gives those naturalistic explanations methodologically. People presume, well, scientists are anti-religion, they're anti-faith, because they never in their professional work speak of faith. So I understand and I also think that can breed this notion among scientists of scientism. The science is the only path toward truth. So there is that danger, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That's fine. I don't have to go any further. My desire is that Christians, whether they're ID, whether they are RTB or evolutionary creationists, should really support each other more than fight each other. Maybe I'm being too negative, but I see this happening because I'm active in all three of them. I mean, I'm interested in all three groups.
Yeah, Ken, if I may comment a bit here, and you said it a little bit differently in the question that you submitted in writing, but you did refer to biases and that comment about people looking at bias, and I think that's a topic worth a little bit more thought. And let me just briefly say that we all have to recognize that we're biased. Every one of us. Denying that we're biased and we're totally objective is simply not plausible. I'm biased. I know I am. Everyone is. And in a way, scientific methodology is based on a bias. We're kind of all conservative scientists. We're biased that the consensus is right, and you got a high bar to prove the rest of the community that there's something different here. So yeah, we do have a bias, and of course, as graduate students, what we're taught is we're totally biased that the rest of the world is right in general, except our particular field, and that's where everyone's wrong, and we're coming up with a new solution. And then we have to prove to the world that we've got a new solution. So there's a tendency where bias is okay, but we have to recognize it, and we have to look beyond it and say, let's look at it from other people who have different biases, and let's compare it with that. So yes, I think in the review there's some statements say, hey, this must have come from a biased point of view. Yeah, it probably did. And is the other side also biased? Yeah, probably. But what do we do about that? Okay, and let's really look at the evidence to see, because charges of bias cannot be proven or disproven, and they don't say anything about whether the subject being discussed is actually correct or not. So I think where there is a novel idea that is different from the mainstream, the bar is high, appropriately. It should be, no matter what it is. And our TB model is no different from any other kind of model, that we've got to set the bar high, say, hey, why is it that the vast majority of the mainstream scientists see it differently? And what is that difference? And so I think that's why this book is very valuable, to raise some of those issues that haven't been adequately raised to the extent that a lot of people are satisfied. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
No, I appreciate Alex's statement several times that to deal with this, one needs humility, to realize we don't have all the answers. And so we have to be open to each other and love each other, although we may prefer this way or that way as far as the process is concerned. Yeah, I agree with you.
It's a very tight dangerous tightrope that scientists have to walk, because you really have to be open to any new idea, as wild as it sounds. I mean, extrasensory perception, that's not something I tend to go in for, but I have to be open to it. But then I would say, well, where's the evidence? Show me the evidence. If you can convince me, then I will accept it. And as Randy just mentioned, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan put it.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Ken. That was great. So now I'm delighted to have my good friend Marty Pomeroy on, and appreciate you being there. And he's been an RTB leader for many times, and I think he's a very capable advocate of the RTB model, and really appreciate your being here, Marty. And hopefully, I don't recognize names, a number of your friends as well. But you did submit a few questions in advance, and I'll give you the microphone here.
So I have to pick one?
One at a time, okay?
That's okay. If I may just briefly comment, Alex, on the thigh bone from the whale. I mentioned to you in an email that I'm a software engineer, and I cannot tell you how much vestigial code there is in almost every system I have ever worked on. I don't personally have a theological requirement that God eliminate all vestigial code from the genome, and so I don't have a problem with that. But the question that I would like to ask is about time, because you used the word millennia, so I'm going to corner you on this one just a little bit here. You used the word all these millennia as sort of a justification as to how this sort of could have happened on its own. And I find that a common argument, time, but I find that to be a very one-dimensional approach to the problem of probability that's associated with mutation and natural selection. And as I wrote in my question, that's as bad as looking at a protein with n amino acids and claiming that the probability of the protein is 1 over 20 to the n, which is what some shall we say, amateur ID apologists might claim. I would love to see, and I believe David Berlinski stated, until we have a good mathematical model of evolution that shows how it can actually happen in the time available, the number of mutations available, the density of life in the oceans, that sort of thing. Why is there no Drake equation for evolution that makes sense to us all?
So I think time is a little bit of a red herring here. And I think that Charles Darwin got us started off on the wrong foot. No fault to him, because he obviously couldn't have been aware of genes and genetic mechanisms in his day. But he believed that evolution necessarily must operate as a very careful, slow, gradual, stepwise process. And most of the biologists I work with these days would say, sure, microevolution works that way. There's tiny little mutations that accrue both in coding and specifically in lots of non-coding regions. But and I don't need to necessarily get into coding versus regulatory genes, but we've really gained an appreciation for the fact that there are not only genes that produce structures like this, but that turn them on and turn them off. And we're realizing that a lot of evolution occurs very rapidly when genes are activated or deactivated or multiplied, repeated, and so on. So I think this is one of the really exciting areas in evolutionary biology these days, is the rates of evolution. So I'm really grateful to you, Marty, for pointing this out. But as I mentioned to you in a private email thread, Marty, the field of evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO, has shown that you can get very major changes in phenotype in an organism almost immediately. We can tweak a gene and you can change a snail with a shell into a slug like that. We know that birds, you've probably heard the expression rare as a hen's tooth. We know now that all birds have vestigial genes that would enable them to produce vestigial teeth if there's a mutation in the regulatory gene that has simply turned that off. So I think there's this unfortunate notion, and again, I would attribute it to Darwin, that evolution is necessarily slow and steady and gradual, whereas really the weight of the evidence now is that not just with environmental change, so going back 50 years to the idea of punctuated equilibrium, where you get a major change in environment because things reach a tipping point and then suddenly you go into a glacial period or something like that. Certainly that can lead to some major changes in evolution, but I would argue that it's less the external or extrinsic forces and more the internal forces. And if you get a mutation in a regulatory gene, you can get a change immediately. I don't know if that's going to satisfy you, but
may I respond? I think that the change in the regulatory gene simply turns on or turns off something informational which is already in the genome. And I don't have any problems with jumps in phenotype. What I have problems with is the accumulation of useful features from nothing, which has to be at the beginning. And so that's where I think you need a mathematical model at the molecular level to get that information into the genome in the first place. And that's where I have a strength in mathematics, and that's just my skepticism along with the authors of the book. It's sort of like I've looked at the data and I just don't find it compelling.
Well, and again, I apologize here if I'm speaking down because I know you're all a very educated, bright audience, but there's a tremendous misconception among the general public that evolution is a random process. The raw material, the mutations that change the genes, and I believe that many of them occur in non-coding genes that are not expressed until they're tweaked and turned on, and suddenly you can get a big change. But the whole idea of selection is that it's directed. It's a non-random process. If you're breeding dogs, you don't say, oh, I'll just randomly decide which one of these pups is going to go on to mate for the next generation. No, you're very carefully controlling for behavior, for form, and so on. And that's what nature does. It's the organisms that live to survive and reproduce, that is very much non-random. So because you get this ratcheted change, you can get some major changes in a really short time. So I agree with you, Marty. I would love to see more work done on the mathematical modeling. And I think with new advances in computer science, we're seeing just that. And by the way, I'm not just talking about things like the Lenski experiment with microevolution in bacteria. I'm talking about macroevolution. I'm talking about the formation of new species, and not just in microbes, but in higher forms of life, although I dislike that phrase, but other kinds of things, animals and plants and so on.
For the sake of others, I should probably yield, but I'd love to discuss this with you more.
Well, Marty, you had a couple of other questions here, but I appreciate it. I do want to come back to you, but we've got a few other people that have had their hands up, and it may relate to this discussion. So let me give each of them a chance to comment. Fred, you were the first to raise your hand. You have a comment along these lines?
The more I think about this, the more I think there's kind of there's something that, well, I'll call them 6 24-hour Christians and atheistic evolutionists agree on. If there is a God, God did not use evolution to create. Then the 6 24-hour Christians say there is a God, so there's no evolution. The atheistic evolution say there's evolution, so there's no God. Where did this straw man come from? I perceive there's a God, and God used evolution to create. In fact, that God could use evolution and over 13.8 billion years come up with something as phenomenal as humanity and the life that we know, the universe that we know, shows how big God is rather than anything else. I put that in the category of the miracle of God, that evolution could be used. You couldn't get a graduate student to evolve something. For one thing, they could only be there 4 years or whatever. Where did this straw man come from?
Well, I mean, this is above my pay grade, but this is why I tell students, you're free to believe whatever you want. But I just don't understand why that should necessarily interfere with your acceptance of modern science. It is a straw man. I agree with you, Fred, and it's a very unfortunate one.
Well, let me interject a little bit here, because I think the historians in ASA have had quite a bit to say about that. And of course, there are multiple sources, not a single point. And but certainly a major factor sliding it in that way was that immediately after Darwin published his book, there was a group of people, including Huxley and John Tyndall and White and a number of other people that you know, that immediately pounced on it as a means of opposing the clergy, with whom they'd had their differences over the decades, and they had a definite intent of twisting the evolutionary concept into one that would diminish the influence and strength of the clergy. And you can kind of trace a lot of the influence. Certainly their research, which has over the years been debunked in many ways, had a powerful influence in generating that particular straw man. So I'm sure there are other sources as well, but there are a number of historical threads that led to this kind of conflict.
And my question would be, why did we as Christians bait to this? Why is this huge stumbling block about the concept of evolution? Why doesn't that make us realize how big God is, rather than saying, well, that means there's no God or something like that?
Well, David Livingstone put that out, the historian. I mean, he put that very clearly. He shows the example of two Presbyterian churches in Scotland, one of which came to accept that view of evolution as God's way of creating, and the other one adamantly opposed to it. What was the difference? Well, the one that was opposed to evolution was one where I believe it was John Tyndall had come and spoken and had says, hey, this evolution, if it is true, it will mean that God didn't create the world. And the congregation, publicizing it, it's like, we're not scientists here. And they say, well, if that's true, then obviously we have to oppose the evolution. And the two churches went in a different direction. So it's hard when you have a non-scientific community listening to these kind of arguments. It's tough. Well, anyway, the history is there. It certainly does exist in this society in many ways. All right. Thank you, Fred. Steve, is that Steve Huffy? Do I recognize you correctly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yep, you're on.
Question: are there specific points of theology which coordinate and perhaps drive the RTP book point of view?
Marty, do you want to answer that one, or Alex? You and Fred one? Maybe it's.
There are better people than me to answer that.
I'm not with RTP, but I spend a lot of time talking with them. Unless there's someone from RTP who wants to take preeminence, I'm offering to kind of explain a little bit. Yeah.
Well, take a stab at it. Marty will correct you, I'm sure. Go ahead, Josh.
So to be clear, where this is coming from is just having sympathetic dialogue with them over the last several years and spending a lot of time with Hugh Ross, AJ Fuzz, and a lot of the scholars in their community, such as Ken Keithley. So first of all, I mean, there's a lot of disagreement within that community about different things, but there are some really big commonalities. So an example of a theological concern that really drives them is historical Adam, that comes out in the last chapter of their book. And they mean that in particular ways. They're also very closely aligned with the Chicago Statements on Inerrancy. So that's another theological concern. That's basically like a founding. I mean, I cannot imagine an RTB community or the people with them not always continuing to affirm the Chicago Statements. An example, that those statements are okay with an old Earth, but they specifically rule out, mythological only readings of Adam and Eve. Some things are a bit more particular to them. They are pretty committed to the theological idea that humans are roughly consistent with Homo sapiens, not the genus Homo or something larger, and that Neanderthals aren't fully human, but they did interbreed. But that's kind of like this idea of like humans arising that way is pretty important to them. They have a particular view of the image of God that really drives us as well. And when it comes to a lot of these questions about evolution, one of the things that surprised me about it is they're not actually opposed to common descent in quite the same ways that I thought. A really core thing seems to be wanting to be able to tell an apologetic case that God had to be involved somehow. It's not necessarily denying common descent in all its forms. And so you'll get disagreement with Hugh Ross, who basically thinks every species is really created individually on its own, to others that are high up, I'm just not going to name them, that might even be okay with saying fully phylums are kind of arise by essentially naturalistic processes even. And so, that's a pretty wide gap. And some of them internally in their scholars community are, for all intents and purposes, they're theistic evolutionists too. But a core theological concern, and it really comes out of Hugh's testimony in astrophysics, is this idea of wanting to tell a story of the science that can be a pointer towards God. And so that's, I think, a presuppositional starting point. And Marty's nodding along with me on this. And so, and I think with this, I'll just blend my quick points, and so I don't have to give anything after this, because I think there's a lot of things that are being equivocated in the questions here. First of all, I think common descent is very different than the mechanisms by which change happens. And so we do need to keep that separate. So also, whether or not God was involved is not always something that science can really tell us anyways. But there's also a distinction between God being involved and having evidence to show it versus just God being involved and it's really being invisible to science. And then also just making the atheistic claim that God wasn't involved. These are kind of pretty big, different things. And I think reasons to believe is kind of marked out at different spots and all of that. So, these are, and I think these distinctions are really important for better dialogue here, because they're not really opposing evolution writ large. It's actually some very narrow disagreements that actually do make quite a bit of a sense inside of their theological context. Now, maybe their theology is wrong, but and maybe their understanding of science is wrong at times too. But I think meeting it in those with a little more precision could lead to a lot better dialogue. My final comment to Marty, just as I kind of jump off, is just that there are mathematical models of evolution too. I'm a computational biologist. That's an area where I've done a lot of work to even help reasons to believe when they thought about population genetics and such. One of the things that surprised me the most and actually convinced me out of older creationism and ID is when I found out how strong the mathematical basis was for evolution, and I encountered that just as a graduate student and really engaged with that. That's what really switched my mind, and I just found out that most people in the origins debate were just not aware of it. So anyways, I can talk about that later with you, but that's just my thoughts.
Josh, would you mind, I don't mean to interrupt, but would you mind just putting a couple of references to those strong papers in the chat line? Yeah. Okay, because I
already put a couple comments.
I haven't read it, so maybe you've already done it.
I'm happy to answer questions in the chat, but there's just a vast amount. Each of them is going to answer different sorts of questions. But
it's all right. Just get a couple.
And we also have to remember that science can't answer every question too. There's a lot of unknowns. And so I think when it comes down to it, I don't think we can ever say with confidence that naturalistic evolution is the whole story. I think that would be a big mistake.
Well, but so this is the problem for science, that God can always creep into the equation. You could always say it's because of God. That just doesn't get us anywhere. Science would get nowhere. We'd just be spinning our wheels if that could. So this is why science is not about proving things. It's about disproving things, because we can do that. We can gain traction. We can do that in our day jobs by looking at objective empirical evidence. So this is the question I pose to people. A lot of people have rejected and fought against evolution for a long time. What evidence could you come up with that would disprove evolution? I could very easily come up with a number of very clear, discrete, objective things that could disprove evolution. But I ask you all now to think about, what do you think? What could do it? And I'm happy to tell you, to outline a number of things that I think if you were to find evidence, I would immediately say, yep, evolution's wrong.
May I?
And despite
you leave that for thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to tell you what some of those are, but despite a lot of people working very hard for millennia, Marty, nobody has been able to come up with those things.
Marty, did you want to respond to what Josh was saying about the?
Yes, I appreciate it, Josh. Lots of respect for your book and for your comments there. I think, and in the chat was the use of the word like theology driving conclusions, and I would have to say, I think the answer to that is actually no. It's looking for the Augustine two books view of nature and the Bible, and God has given us both forms of revelation, that sort of thing. And I think that what the RTB folks are trying to do is look at both of these things and say, what makes the most sense to me? And when someone comes to the conclusion that the sole sort of evolutionary model as the only means of the change of life through history is not adequate, and then certain theological conclusions are certainly rational within that framework. So I don't think they're trying to force things together in either direction. They're not trying to force the science. I don't think they're trying to force their interpretation either. I just think it's sort of a reasoning to the best explanation that summarizes both.
Okay. Thank you both. Dave Wilcox, good to see you here. Your comments.
Couple comments. One of them is, I think that one of the confusions is that a statement that any causal chain has occurred apart from the hand of God is a theological statement, not a scientific statement. So whenever you say this has happened apart from the hand of God, you're making a theological statement. Richard Dawkins does a lot of them. It's not science.
Right.
And therefore saying that something has happened because God did it is also a theological statement, not a scientific statement, and it's not testable.
Right.
The other is...
maybe I'm slow, but explain to me how saying something happened apart from the hand of God, how is that theological?
If you're saying that something happens apart from the hand of God, you're making a statement about God.
But so
you're not making a statement about the causal chain. You're making a statement about God. You're saying God didn't do that. And if you say God didn't do that, you're making a statement not about the event.
Well, but my point is we couldn't have science if God because there's no way to test statements about God.
You don't, but in science, we're not testing the presence of God. We're testing the causal chain.
That's right. But
when you say that God's is or is not involved in the causal chain, you're making a theological statement.
Well, but my point is statement. Yeah, well, that's the difference between ontological naturalism and methodological. So science is not saying that God doesn't exist. It's just saying there's no way we can test that. So we're going to conveniently leave that out of the picture and not go there.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that those kinds of statements are theological statements. Therefore, we can't test them in science. I think I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, I think you're both saying the same thing. Because
I think so, yeah. But I wouldn't phrase it as that's being theological, but I take your point. I see where you're coming from.
But Alex, he's saying that those who are making that statement are going beyond science and making a presupposition about what God did or didn't do.
Whether they're a Christian or not, they're making a statement about theology.
Yeah.
But I had a question about what I was wondering your opinion about the role of accumulated genetic diversity within an existing species as a raw material for allowing rapid evolutionary change.
I think it can be, yes. And there's different models of what evolution is. I understand why a lot of people adhere more to an idea of straight line evolution, what we would call orthogenesis or anagenesis, incremental change over time within a species. And I think that's extremely common. Where a lot of people, I think for obvious reasons, get hung up is the appearance of really new forms, the appearance of whales from non-whale ancestors, and how can that happen? And this is where I think you're not just doing minor tweaks in coding genes and adding or subtracting a nucleotide, but really changing the expression. So you're doing both major leaps in ecology, but also major genetic changes inside. So, but to answer your question, yeah, I do think that that steady drip of small mutations can lead to big change. Absolutely.
Well, living populations have vast stores of genetic diversity, which in the 20th century they didn't think it was there.
Yeah.
In the modern synthesis.
So this was, yeah, absolutely. And this was Darwin's tremendous contribution to the field, because it really changed the view from this notion of Platonic idealism and that any difference in an organism was a flaw. And he saw things entirely differently and said, wait a minute, no, this variation is really the key. And it's an important thing. It's a good thing. It's not something that is an error that we want to kind of, sweep under the rug. But this is one of the ways I think that you could falsify evolution. If you were, well, first of all, if you were to find any organism that doesn't have DNA, that's a huge monkey wrench for evolution. Second, if you were to find any organism that doesn't have any variation, either in its genetic code or in its phenotype, that right there, I don't know how evolution could survive if that would be the case. And then third, if you were to find any organism that has completely unique genetic information, none of which is shared with any other organism, I think that's a stab in the heart of evolution. We've not found anything like that. If you were to find an organism wherein the genetic coding is completely at odds with what we see in terms of its phenotype, for example, if we were to take a whale that looks, it's an air-breathing mammal that produces milk and has a little bit of hair, and yet if you were to find genetically it's more closely related to fish, that's pretty hard to argue evolution if you were to find a conclusion. That's just four of many ways that you could disprove evolution. Yeah. So, and I could go on and on.
Or a human skull in the Cambrian.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the obvious one that people think of, is that problem with the geological strata. And that's an obvious one. Sure. If you were to find a billion-year-old human fossil, or as somebody put in the chat, a billion-year-old rabbit fossil. Yeah. So that's a fifth way we could disprove evolution. My point is, lots of people have sought to disprove evolution. Every piece of evidence we find supports evolution. Nobody's been able to find one iota of empirical, objective, natural evidence that disproves evolution.
All right.
Lots of people are trying to do it.
We'll give Marty a chance in a little bit to comment on that. But let's hear from Keith Miller first. Keith, thank you, Dave, by the way. Appreciate that. Keith, let's unmute your... Yeah, there you go.
Just two kind of very different comments. One is with regard to the action of God. I think one thing that gets left out of the conversation from a Christian perspective is a focus on how God acts in the world and what the scriptural testimony is to God's action. And I would argue that Scripture is pretty clear that God is active in all aspects of creation. One point I make is that God just doesn't act in what we might perceive as a miracle, something that seems extraordinary or unexplained initially, at least. But that God is actively involved in the creation all the time in all aspects of creation. And if you have that view, it undermines a lot of these false dichotomies that people bring to the discussion. So your faith, your understanding of God's creative involvement isn't threatened by any particular scientific conclusion. If we have a cause and effect explanation for a particular event or a series of events, that's great. God was intimately, actively involved in that process. If you have a current gap in our understanding, that's great. God is still there. I mean, it doesn't affect how you understand God's participation in creation. So that's the one thing.
Okay.
The other thing has to do with I forget what the other line was going to go.
Yeah, that happens in retirement here, Keith. You're
Yeah,
getting it.
tell me about it.
It must. Right. Okay. Go ahead. You want to come back to it later?
Raise my hand again if it comes back.
Okay, yeah, take it down. But thanks for the comment. Alex, you want to respond to that?
So
And then
my
we'll go to
only
Marty.
issue, and I don't mean to tread on a hornet's nest here, but yeah, I agree with that point, Keith. But here's the issue a lot of people have with that scriptural testimony is that you can interpret it in multiple ways. In the objective world of science, if I give you a telephone or other device and I say, how many grams is the mass of this? How many millimeters is the length of this? We'll all come up with the same answer. And yet if we look at sacred texts, we could each of us come up with a different interpretation. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but what I'm saying is this is why science exists outside of our realm of personal belief. There's so much that science can't answer, and that's why we need a lot more than science. Point conceded. But in order to do our daily work, to understand the natural world in which we live, we just have to put those beliefs aside and focus on empirical objective evidence. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. We will disagree about everything. We won't be able to agree on the mass or the length of anything. It's such a simple point, and I apologize for being so pedantic and condescending, but people don't grasp that.
That's good.
I agree with you. Tom, one of the things I emphasize repeatedly is the necessity of methodological naturalism. So that's not
we're on the same wavelength.
What I'm getting at is I'm a Christian, therefore my theology matters, and we should have the same desire to seek truth in our theology as we do in our science. And I would argue that the scriptural testimony, to me, is fairly clear. And again, obviously there's a lot of disagreement, but the point is, if you take what I believe is a thoroughly orthodox understanding of how God operates in the universe, it completely eliminates the apparent tension. So that's what we're talking about here, is this unnecessary conflict or tension between faith and science. Mm-hmm. And one big part of that is how you understand your faith. So that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Keith. And that point has been made by others. I think it was Dell earlier and others. But I mean, putting aside for a moment, even Christianity versus, let's say, Buddhism or some other thing, even within Christianity, you ask 100 Christians and you'll get a lot of disagreement. So I take your point that you're coming at this from a Christian perspective, but there's so many different factions and faiths even within Christianity. I mean, we've already alluded to this, young earth versus theistic creationism and so on. So it's hard for people to be on the same page when you're talking about faith. That's why I keep coming back to it is your personal belief. And that's wonderful, but the next person in the next room may have a completely different story and say, I'm a Christian as much as you. And yet he or she has a completely different view of the world. So that's why it's often intractable. Sorry.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you, Keith. So Marty, I think we got a bunch of things to come back to you on. You had a couple of submitted questions that still remain to be put on the floor, and you may want to respond to some of the things here recently. So let me give you the floor.
Sure. In support of what Keith was just saying, I think that there is a foundational understanding of the providence of God. Whether there's been divine action in the history of life, that's kind of like, that's sort of what we're arguing, what RTB is arguing. Well,
not merely about whether, but also if there's evidence to demonstrate for it too, right? So there's a lot of people who would grant that there was divine action, but the part of disagreement is whether or not that can be demonstrated from the scientific evidence in particular domains. Would you agree with that, Marty?
Yes, that's a good point, Josh. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. A very difficult problem, that's for sure. But as far as a question that I had put together and sent ahead of time, I would go ahead and it's somewhat related to this. And I'm going to go ahead and just try to read it because I put it together pretty well. Genetics, biochemistry, chemistry, physics, astrophysics, these are all hard sciences. It seems to me that evolution is a narrative around the data. A lot of science is done to help clarify the data, but data that does not fit the narrative is ignored or explained away. And I think examples are the Cambrian explosion, the angiosperm radiation, and at the molecular level, orphan genes and human accelerated regions. The argument is that seemingly new information must have been developing, but just left no evidence. And I would push just sort of gently that that's a bit of naturalism of the gaps, and it makes evolution somewhat non-falsifiable. The new information for the Cambrian explosion, for example, had to be massive. So here's the question: is evolution any less of a narrative than intelligent design?
So I would argue that evolution is a far more falsifiable science than something like modern physics, string theory, something like that, where I think people are theorizing with very precious little empirical evidence. And I would argue that people, and I know this is not your question, Marty, but evolution, the study of evolution is not merely historical. Evolution is very much an ongoing process. So no person has ever visited another planet, no human from Earth. And yet we know a lot about other planets. I don't think any person needs to have existed in the Cambrian for us to be able to say a lot about that. Now, I would be the first to say that we're dealing with very fragmentary evidence. Many of the creatures that existed back then did not fossilize. Of all those that did, probably lots of those fossils have been lost, or the vast majority have not been uncovered. So it's like trying to explain a movie when you just peek your head into the theater and see 10 seconds of the film. And from those little glimpses, we're trying to tell the whole story. But I think when you get more of these glimpses, you're able to, and sometimes you see the next glimpse and you go, oh my gosh, I was wrong. I thought it was a mystery thriller, and now I find out it's a comedy. I'm going to have the humility to change my story on the basis of new evidence. But I agree with you, Marty, that the claims often outstretch the evidence, particularly in fields like paleoanthropology, when you get people whose careers are made or broken on the basis of a tiny little fragment of a proto-human skull. And people are making often exaggerated claims on the basis of little evidence. So point taken there. On the other hand, I think science as a whole is a self-correcting process. And we often find, hey, we were wrong. And so we're going to change up the story now. So I think you're a little too strong in your condemnation of science as not being, or evolutionary science, I should say, as really making a lot of broad claims on the basis of very limited evidence.
Well,
anyway.
I was going to say, I would agree with you that there's various levels of evidence that's available. It's just that when some people look at the data and conclude that the processes we know about are inadequate to produce the complexity that we see. And being able to prove that statement is wrong is also very difficult. I would disagree with you on something you said earlier, that the progressive creation position is a science stopper. I don't find that at all. I mean, I think there's plenty of stuff to study. It's just that I may have an opinion that it may not be worth. I don't know. There's different ways of doing these things, but I find I am uncomfortable with that. I think I love science, and I'm perfectly happy to have people try to do science around origins of life, though I'm not convinced we'll find a naturalist pathway for that. So anyway, I don't want to dominate this, but there's certainly a lot of room for discussion.
And nor do I want it to. And I apologize for making this point again, but this is why we seek to disprove in science rather than approve, because you could have a perfectly good explanation, as you just said. The problem is there could be a better explanation. If you can't start your car and your friend says, oh, it's because it's possessed by a demon spirit, it could be right. It could also be, so he goes and gets a friend who chants something, a shaman, and then the car starts. Did that prove he was right? Possibly. It could also be that the fuel line was flooded and needed to clear. It could be that the battery was damp and it needed to dry out. So there's no way you can disprove his claim that the car was possessed by a spirit. But if you were to make other claims like, oh, we're out of gas, so put in gas, and then if the car doesn't start, you've disproved that claim. that it did. Or if you were to say the battery's bad, that's why it's not starting. Switch the battery, still doesn't start, you've disproved that. That's how science advances, not by proving things, but just by disproving things. Because there could always be a better explanation that you're not thinking of.
I will quickly throw in that a lot of people who deal with technology do believe that there are demons in there sometimes.
Especially those bugs you find in the software. Right?
Oh, man.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Can I kind of put out something that a number of you alluded to in one way or the other, but I think Marty expressed it most, and I think it's in the book at a few spots, which is this notion of the inference to the best explanation. And as I understand the RTB model, at least the way in which it was expressed in the book, is that there are places, I mean, they fully endorse the evolutionary process for a vast range of things, but they're saying there are a few places where we believe in the RTB model that the inference to the best explanation is a intermittent creation involvement at some places where the evolutionary explanation doesn't work. I guess based on what a few of the others you made comment is that God's creation there as a intervention, if you will, together with some evolution is not a viable explanation at all. It can't be a scientific explanation. So if that's the case, how can an inference be made to it as a best explanation? In other words, the two are not in the same category. It's a category error to say that we're really comparing that model with a scientific model. I don't know. What am I missing there?
You're asking me, right?
Yes, Marty. Yeah,
I'm trying to fully understand the question because I don't think divine intervention and evolutionary processes are incompatible in any way. And I'm hearing you say that RTB thinks that they are.
No, I don't know if no, I'm not saying they're incompatible.
Okay.
But as I understand the RTB model is that the evolutionary theory isn't complete, doesn't explain everything.
Okay.
And that this is an indication of where God's creative acts, come into play.
That's possible, yes. That's right.
And that this is when you think of it, the inference is that is a better explanation. I'm just saying, comparing the two, the scientific explanation versus God's intervention explanation. These aren't really in the same category that they can be compared. They don't oppose each other, all right? True. But you can't say it's one or the other. Which one is better? It's a category error there, right?
Well, I think we'd have a lot of agreement on this. I would just throw in one additional point, and that is theologically. I think that the progressive creation model reflects how I feel God works in our lives today. Occasionally we get this divine intervention in our lives. Most of the time we're kind of running under God's providence. I would pull those two together, but it's simply, yes, inference to the best explanation. I'm personally not convinced that the amount of information that showed up in the Cambrian explosion didn't involve God injecting some code into our biosphere somehow. It's a struggle to try and parse these out, but
yeah, okay, fair enough. We're almost running out of time. We have about 8 more minutes. You and I will continue discussing as we always do, right, Marty?
Forever.
Yeah, right. It would be fun. We can't agree, Marty, because then we'd stop having fun together.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of quick comments. Hey, we've got Keith, Ken, and Eric lined up here. Okay, we'll have to squeeze that into 8 minutes. Keith, you thought of it?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll be brief. I think one thing that has been brought out in the discussion is different lines of evidence. For example, my field is paleontology. So when I look at evolution, I'm looking at it through a paleontological lens. I'm not a geneticist. And although I have basic understanding of genetics, I'm not a geneticist. That isn't my field. My field is paleontology. But the paleontological record is absolutely persuasive to me about the reality of the continuity of evolution over time and the continuity of that while the fossil record itself isn't continuous, it has bits that are. So you can actually see speciation events in the fossil record, but you're not going to see the whole record of speciation events over the whole lineage of a particular group of organisms. But you see these morphological trends. And for example, one of the curiosities about paleontology is the difficulty in defining not just species, but all taxonomic groups. Because all of them, when you go back in time towards their common ancestors, the distinctive morphological features disappear, and you get this melange of different organisms that people disagree on how to classify them because the classification criteria break down. That's exactly what you would expect in a branching tree. As you go down the branches, get to approach the common ancestors, the morphological distinctiveness of those groups dissipate, and you have a mess, and you can't figure it out, and things jump around in different categories. And that works all the way up to the phyla. So I'm just saying that there's a whole lot of different lines, and that says nothing about the genetics involved. It just says that the fossil record provides another completely independent line of evidence.
Okay, fair enough. That's great, Keith. Let's move on. We'll quick 5 minutes left here. Ken.
For Alex, is there any particular significance to that really long hundreds or thousands of generations of some species of a single-celled organism that have been generated through petri dishes?
Is there any significance to that? Absolutely, yeah, because they've shown in this Lenski experiment that a lot of evolution can occur in a fairly short period of time. But so if I can just very briefly comment on what Keith had just been saying, and I'm glad that nobody's raised this whole issue of missing links and the lack of macroevolution because we have gaps. That is we have tremendous evidence for transitional forms. The way I often phrase it to people, obviously every individual is descended from their two parents. You're similar to them, and yet you're not exactly the similar. So where's the missing link between you and your parents? I mean, this is like the philosophy of Zeno's paradox. Every time you try and plug some gap, there's going to be a smaller gap in between them. But with regard to your question, Ken, about this study of microbial change, the point that I try to make to people, again, science being counterintuitive, is that people think natural selection's job is to change things, where in contrast, the whole point of natural selection is to perpetuate the status quo, to keep things the same, to cull out any differences, things that are not the same. And the evolutionary biologist George C. Williams pointed this out. This is why, if you read the descriptions from the ancients of plants and animals of a couple thousand years ago, they're very similar to ours. The giraffes and leopards he describes, or that Aristotle describes, are the same as those today, because in the absence of any major internal intrinsic genetic or external environmental change, natural selection is just going to cull out the same way that a dog or plant breeder will do and keep things exactly the same. It's counterintuitive, but it's the way natural selection works.
Thank you.
All right. One final question from Eric. Eric, could you introduce yourself? I don't know your last name. I don't see you. Who are you, please?
I do software development for scientific research in the biological sciences.
Okay. Good to have you here.
Just to try to get this in quick, but you had raised some questions earlier about inference is the best explanation, how to infer, is there a category error? And other comments have been made by Alex and others. And I fully agree that for certain kinds of things, if you thought Jesus had supernaturally created wine from water, is there anything you could do to test that wine to tell you whether or not that was supernaturally created? No, I'm not sure that there is anything like that. But I want to pose that there is a different framework in which to understand there is a legitimate inference to the best explanation. And that is that even within a naturalistic framework, you have at least three different categories of causation. You've got things that happen according to law-like behaviors of operating on intrinsic properties, physics and chemistry. You also have things that happen by chance arrangements, but we also have things which only happen by choice. Choice is a different kind of mechanism and is able to create arrangements which Leslie Orgel called specified complexity. And he wasn't sympathetic to the idea of design, but he did recognize that one of the primary difficulties about developing, say, an origin of life explanation is that life is distinguished. Living organisms are distinguished by their specified complexity. They're not like granite with an arbitrary arrangement. They're not like crystals that have a well-ordered arrangement that's based on physics and chemistry. They have this arrangement that's functional, not arbitrary, but it's an arrangement that cannot be determined by physical and chemical properties. And so specified complexity in any other context we've always found is due to choice by intelligent agents. And even if you don't consider it in the context of is it supernatural or not supernatural, it's a distinct causal framework. And it's one in which we can look at questions like, is it reasonable to attribute processes of law and chance to writing an information processing system? So in this, I share a lot of Marty's questions. I really don't see that law plus chance explanations can be plausibly used to explain information and information processing. It really doesn't match up as a good inference to the best explanation.
Thank you, Eric. So since we're a little past time, I do want to give Alex time to respond to this because it's an important point that you raise, Eric. I appreciate your coming in.
Yeah, and I'll try to be very brief. So you said a lot of very wise things, Eric, in setting that up, but I just disagree with your conclusion because I think you can, with a completely naturalistic explanation, explain the perpetuation of life. Maybe not necessarily its origin, which strictly speaking is outside the realm of evolution, which deals with change in life over time. But I think increasingly you can come up with good naturalistic explanations for the origin of life. That is not to say that God didn't have a hand in it, but that's still operating according to natural laws, which are objective and repeatable. I think you can do that, and many scientists agree. And now, to Marty's point and to your point, are they perhaps stretching the truth? I don't think so. I think there's a wealth of information that we lack, and that would help us to flesh out our explanations a whole lot more. And I'm looking forward to it, and doing a better job of giving better explanations. But that's what science does.
Okay. Eric, thank you for bringing it up. As you may know, and most of the people here would know, that's one of my favorite topics that you raised, and I would love to engage with you privately. If you so wish, just submit a comment on the diving deeper question, and I'd love to pursue this more because it's vital to discuss that. We're out of time, John. You want to make us even later than we are?
I do, Randy. Just briefly, though, I'm not going to raise the question that I sent in to you earlier. Wonderful discussion today. I just wanted to put this in context. This is quintessential ASA. Folks, if you're new to the ASA, this has been going on for over 80 years. And you're in a moving stream in the church and in the history, and it is wonderful to behold. And so I want to give that shout out, because as we all know, there are not very many places where people deeply respect and love one another and express it in this way. As one of my colleagues said, work shows your love of your neighbor. And I think what we have been doing and experiencing in the review, in the book, in our conversations today and ongoing is an expression of our love in Christ and for each other. And that's the thing that holds us together. And then we just disappear. I mean, we disagree all the Alex, I'm with you. I'm an evolutionary ecologist, so I get what you're talking about. Long history and all this stuff. Thank you, and thank you, Randy, for hosting this.
All right. Alex, did you have anything nugget you want to leave with us, or?
Thank you. You're a lot of very bright and nice people, and it's been a pleasure. So thank you.
Okay, good. And thank you for the review. Thank you for this program. Thank all of you for joining us today. We'll see you on September 10th. Farewell.